I speak now of a time when the world was sharply divided, when ideologies clashed and the superpowers lurked in secret and open theaters, and amid that contest America stepped into a war that would test its military strength, its moral compass, its politics, and its very belief in victory. I recall a scene of rice paddies and jungles, of villagers caught between bombs and guerrillas, of bright young soldiers in fatigue gear sweating under the Vietnamese sun, and the U.S. President in Washington pacing over maps, weighed down by reports of body counts and protester columns back home. I tell you now of the Vietnam War, especially during the administrations of Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon, a war that started in hope of containment and anti-communism, but ended in a question no speech could fully answer. Did America win? Or did it lose? We begin in the early 1960s, with America deeply convinced that communism must be contained. President Kennedy, wary of losing Southeast Asia to communist influence, increased advisors to the government of South Vietnam. He saw over there what many in Washington saw here: the dominoes, if one fell, might knock down the rest. The South Vietnamese government, fragile and shaky, led by No Dinh Diem, was corrupt, under-resourced, often despised by its people, yet propped up by U.S. funds and advisors. Diem's assassination in 1963 after a U.S.-supported coup foreshadowed how messy things would get. President Kennedy's death and the succession of Lyndon Johnson opened a new chapter. Under Johnson, the war escalated rapidly. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, a disputed event in which U.S. naval vessels claimed aggression by North Vietnamese boats, gave Johnson political cover. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving him broad authority to increase U.S. military involvement without a formal declaration of war. Johnson sent more and more troops. He launched massive bombing campaigns over North Vietnam. By 1965, American ground troops were deployed in combat in large numbers. Helicopters, napalm, search and destroy missions, all became routine. And back home, newsreels and television sets brought images of Marlboro smoke silhouetted soldiers, jungles, suffering civilians. Johnson understood that military power was enormous, but he also came to see that public opinion was fragile. The Vietnamese terrain was foreign and brutal. The enemy, the Viet Cong in the south and regular North Vietnamese army units, moved through jungles, tunnels, hamlets. They blended with civilians, struck then disappeared. Conventional warfare, where bombers, tanks, heavy artillery dominate, was less effective when the opponent uses guerrilla tactics, booby traps, surprise attacks in dense jungles, in weather changes, in bursts. America's superior firepower often destroyed terrain and infrastructure but did little to break the will of the North or to sever the supply lines that mattered most. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, weaving through Laos and Cambodia, despite bombing and interdiction efforts, kept feeding troops, supplies, weapons into the struggle. For all its power, America could not halt that lifeline. The strategic cost of trying to do so was high, politically risky, diplomatically sensitive. Concern about provoking China or the Soviet Union limited how far the U.S. was willing to go. Johnson's presidency saw some of the war's most dramatic moments. The Tet Offensive in 1968. Though militarily it failed to deliver expected strategic gains for the North, its psychological impact was enormous. Suddenly, the narrative of progress that Johnson's administration had promoted, of clear victories, of body counts, of territory held, began to unravel in the American mind. The images of fierce fighting in Saigon streets, of American and South Vietnamese forces surrounded, of towns attacked, all broadcast into homes, eroded the perceived legitimacy of the war effort. The war was no longer distant. It entered the living rooms of America. Protests grew across campuses. Mothers wept for sons. Politicians hedged their rhetoric. Johnson, seeing his domestic Great Society programs weighed down by war costs and public discontent, decided not to seek re-election in 1968. The toll in lives, money, morale was rising. The question of whether the U.S. could win, or even knew what winning meant, shadowed every policy. Then came Nixon, elected in 1968 amid promises to bring peace with honor. He inherited a war that was deeply unpopular, that had drained American resources, and that had lost much of its moral clarity. But Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger sought a new path. They introduced Vietnamization, the idea that the U.S. would gradually hand over more of the fight to South Vietnamese forces, reduce American ground involvement, while maintaining air power and negotiations. Behind the scenes, they expanded bombing campaigns into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in secret or semi-secret operations, trying to cut off supply routes, sanctuary zones, but also triggering controversy and protest. They negotiated from both strength and weakness. As U.S. troops were being withdrawn, the war's cost was still high, both in Vietnam and in American public opinion, among soldiers traumatized, among civilians caught in the crossfire. Negotiations in Paris dragged on. Nixon promised that the latest peace plan would protect South Vietnam, allow South Vietnamese government to stand firm, and yet secure release of POWs. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 were signed. U.S. combat forces left South Vietnam. In Washington it was declared that the war was ending, that peace was restored. But the peace was fragile. South Vietnam's government remained dependent on U.S. aid. Its military was now fighting on its own, under severe pressure. No longer shielded by hundreds of thousands of American combat troops, it confronted a relentless North Vietnamese advance, with supplies, morale, leadership that was less capable, corruption that was rampant, and a populace war-weary. Back in South Vietnam, civilian government was weak. Political legitimacy among the people was poor. Corruption, lack of unity, poor leadership, low morale, desertions. And in North Vietnam, unity of purpose, ideological fervor, determination, support from Soviet Union and China, even if imperfect, helped hold up their side. The North saw the war as a war of national liberation, a war for reunification, an existential fight. The South's leaders, often seen as puppets in the Cold War narrative, lacking nationalist legitimacy in the eyes of many peasants and villagers. On April 30, 1975, the capital Saigon fell. The images of helicopters on rooftops, of last-minute evacuations, of South Vietnamese trying to escape as the North marched in, these became symbols of a defeat, not just of territory lost, but of a war, as many Americans felt, lost in purpose, in clarity, in national confidence. The victory belonged to North Vietnam. South Vietnam ceased to exist as a separate entity. The promise once made by U.S. presidents to preserve an independent South Vietnam free from communism was broken. In assessing whether America won or lost, one must ask, what were America's objectives? Prevent communist domination of all Vietnam? Support a stable, non-communist South Vietnam? Maintain U.S. credibility with allies and in the Cold War? If those were the goals, then America failed. Militarily powerful, technologically advanced, economically rich, politically influential, it used all of that. It killed many enemy combatants, destroyed huge amounts of infrastructure, bombed and dropped more ordnance than most wars in modern history. But success was partial at best. There was no lasting political solution, no stable government, no victory in terms of reunification or permanent containment. Yet, some argue that America did succeed in limiting spread of communism elsewhere or showed the moral costs of intervention, helped change how subsequent U.S. foreign policy was conducted, how the public viewed wars, how governments measured success, not just by territory held or enemy killed but by political legitimacy, by public opinion, by media. Those are intangible, harder to quantify, and to many less satisfying. The presidents most associated with this tragedy bear responsibility in different ways. Johnson escalated dramatically, committed U.S. to full combat, war budget, war sacrifices. Nixon sought exit, negotiated peace, but also prolonged some parts of fighting covertly, and in his later years saw South Vietnam falter after U.S. withdrawal. The burden of blame is complex. Strategic misjudgments, underestimating the enemy's will, over-reliance on firepower, insufficient attention to political legitimacy, corrupt allies, domestic pressure, moral questions, media narratives. Perhaps America did not win Vietnam in the conventional sense. But did it lose everything? No. It retained its global alliances, its status as superpower, and eventually saw the Cold War end with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. Lessons learned in Vietnam changed U.S. military doctrine. Limited war, air power doctrine, public support importance, media policy, exit strategies, all rethought. But those lessons came at tremendous cost. Human lives, regional devastation, moral scars. So when I say did America win or lose, I mean, America lost on the ground. America lost in its original purpose. America lost its youngest, its pride, its unchallenged narrative of always progressing forward. But America did not disappear. America did not lose its identity. It changed. The war changed America more than any victory could have. If I were to weigh it, I would say America's outcome in Vietnam was a loss. Of objectives, of lives, of moral clarity. The war reached its end with no triumphant return, only a slow retreat and an unsteady peace. Yet it remains a part of America's history that teaches, power without purpose is fragile, military might without legitimacy is hollow, and a nation's resolve is not tested only in battles but in its capacity to know what it truly fights for. I continue my story as the helicopters still circle over Saigon and the jungles echo with memories of soldiers and civilians who walked these fields. As in Washington the mood darkens, and the weight of a distant war presses on a weary nation. By 1968 the American public had shifted. Confidence had given way to skepticism, slogans of containment replaced by chants of "Bring the boys home." Lyndon B. Johnson had spent his political capital on his Great Society reforms, on civil rights legislation, on a vision of a better domestic America, but Vietnam consumed his presidency. He faced nightly news broadcasts showing casualties, atrocities like the My Lai massacre later uncovered, and a new kind of war where the press roamed far more freely than in previous conflicts. The war was no longer a tidy front-page headline, it was a moving, bleeding, living presence in the homes of Americans. And the question grew louder: why are we there? What does winning even mean? In the jungles and hamlets, American soldiers learned that their missions often brought them into communities that did not see them as liberators. Search and destroy patrols alienated villagers. Pacification programs were undermined by corruption. Body counts became a metric but not a measure of victory. Viet Cong guerrillas, often peasants by day and fighters by night, blended with the local population. For every tactical win, another ambush, another booby trap, another infiltration struck at American troops. The war drained morale. It strained the draft system, sending young men, often working class and minorities, into combat while college students sometimes found deferments. This disparity fueled protests, fed cultural divides, left scars on American society that lasted decades. The Tet Offensive, launched during the Lunar New Year of 1968, was a coordinated assault by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across dozens of cities and outposts in South Vietnam. Militarily, U.S. and South Vietnamese troops pushed back, inflicted heavy casualties. But psychologically, it shattered the claim that the enemy was weakening. It showed Americans that the war's end was not near, that their leaders' optimism was misplaced. The images from Saigon, the sight of Viet Cong inside the U.S. Embassy compound, all these seared into public consciousness. Walter Cronkite, the trusted CBS anchor, famously concluded the war was unwinnable. When America's most trusted broadcaster lost faith, so did much of the nation. Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Within weeks, he announced he would not seek re-election. Vietnam had undone a president who had won in a landslide only 4 years earlier. Richard Nixon entered office promising peace with honor, an end to the war without surrender, a path that would maintain American credibility and save South Vietnam. He and Henry Kissinger pursued a dual strategy: gradual withdrawal of U.S. ground troops, called Vietnamization, combined with intense air power and covert operations to pressure North Vietnam into negotiating. They widened the war secretly into Cambodia and Laos, attacking supply sanctuaries, but these bombings became public and fueled protests at home. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 sparked outrage on college campuses, culminating in the tragic shootings at Kent State University, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students. The war was no longer a distant policy, it was a wound tearing at the fabric of American life. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, President Nguyen Van Thieu presided over a government that remained dependent on U.S. support. Despite American training and equipment, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, lacked the cohesion, leadership, and popular legitimacy of its northern counterpart. Corruption undermined its effectiveness. Many South Vietnamese were weary of war, of shifting governments, of destruction. The North Vietnamese, by contrast, maintained a clear goal: reunification under communist rule. They accepted enormous casualties to achieve it. For them, time and sacrifice were tools of strategy. They believed that as long as they endured, the Americans, far from home and facing domestic dissent, would eventually leave. Negotiations in Paris dragged on through the early 1970s. Kissinger conducted secret talks with North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho. Each side maneuvered for advantage, knowing that public statements were one thing and battlefield realities another. Nixon authorized massive bombing campaigns, the Christmas bombings of 1972, to force concessions. At the same time, he cultivated a relationship with China, hoping to use Beijing's influence on Hanoi. The strategy was complex, mixing withdrawal with escalation, diplomacy with force. Eventually, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. They allowed for a ceasefire, withdrawal of U.S. troops, return of American POWs, and political negotiations in South Vietnam. Nixon declared it peace with honor. But the peace was an illusion. Even as American troops left, fighting resumed. The North Vietnamese continued to build strength. The South Vietnamese, without direct U.S. combat support, struggled to hold territory. American air power, though formidable, could not compensate for declining political will in Washington. The Watergate scandal engulfed Nixon's presidency, weakening his ability to respond when North Vietnam launched major offensives. In August 1974, Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford inherited the final act. In spring 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, a rapid, decisive offensive. South Vietnamese defenses collapsed. Cities fell one after another. Refugees streamed southward. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell. Helicopters lifted Americans and selected South Vietnamese from the embassy rooftop, and chaotic scenes broadcast worldwide. It was the image of a lost war. In the aftermath, Americans grappled with what had happened. Was it a defeat? If the goal had been to preserve a non-communist South Vietnam indefinitely, the answer was yes. If the goal had been to contain communism regionally, some argued the U.S. succeeded in Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, but not in Vietnam. The cost was staggering. Over 58,000 American dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions of Vietnamese dead, Cambodia and Laos destabilized, refugees dispersed worldwide, a generation scarred. Yet, Vietnam changed America in profound ways. It reshaped the military, which abolished the draft and moved to an all-volunteer force. It altered foreign policy, making leaders more cautious about large-scale interventions, until future conflicts tested those limits again. It fueled distrust of government, of official statements, of the gap between rhetoric and reality. It energized investigative journalism. It empowered Congress to reassert war-making authority. It inspired literature, film, music that grappled with trauma, futility, courage, and loss. For the presidents involved, history's verdict is mixed. Johnson is remembered for his domestic achievements and his catastrophic escalation of Vietnam. Nixon for his diplomacy with China, his eventual withdrawal from Vietnam, but also for prolonging the war and for Watergate. Ford for presiding over the final fall, though by then America's choices were limited. Each president faced pressures, intelligence assessments, political calculations. Each believed he was acting in the nation's interest. Each underestimated the enemy's resilience and the difficulty of building a legitimate South Vietnamese state. Each discovered that superior firepower cannot substitute for political legitimacy. And so the narrator's voice drifts back to the central question. Did America win or lose? On the ground in Vietnam, America lost. It failed to achieve its stated goal of keeping South Vietnam permanently independent and non-communist. It withdrew under negotiated terms that quickly unraveled. Its ally collapsed. Its credibility was shaken. But America also endured. It absorbed the blow, re-evaluated its policies, and decades later remained the leading power in the world. In that sense, the loss was tragic but not fatal. The story of Vietnam from Johnson to Nixon is a story of escalation and withdrawal, of optimism turned to disillusionment, of a superpower discovering the limits of its might. It is a cautionary tale about the gap between military means and political ends, between official statements and on-the-ground realities, between a nation's ideals and the messy business of war. It is also a story of individuals, soldiers, civilians, leaders, caught in a conflict far larger than themselves, each leaving behind memories, scars, lessons. As I recount these decades, I see not just battles and treaties but the faces of people. The young Marine stepping off a transport plane at Da Nang, the Vietnamese farmer tending a field pockmarked with craters, the protester holding a sign outside the White House, the president sitting at his desk reading casualty reports late at night. These are the human threads that weave through the abstract tapestry of policy and strategy. These are the reasons the Vietnam War still haunts and teaches. And so the narrator pauses, preparing to move into the final act, where the consequences of this war echo into the future, where America debates what it learned and what it forgot, where historians weigh the decisions of presidents and generals, and where the simple question, win or loss, becomes a mirror for the nation itself. I carry the story forward now into the years after the last helicopters left Saigon, into a country that had to live with the war's aftermath and a superpower that had to reckon with its limits. In the days after April 30, 1975, television screens in the United States showed haunting images. South Vietnamese trying to board the last flights, North Vietnamese tanks rolling through the presidential palace gates, the lowering of one flag and the raising of another. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a long debate at home. Politicians, veterans, families of the fallen all asked the same thing. What was it for? Did we win anything? Or did we lose it all? The official line at first was muted. There was no victory parade, no banners, no crisp speeches about success. Instead there were private reunions of soldiers returning home, sometimes to applause, often to silence or hostility from anti-war protesters. Many veterans found themselves caught between worlds. They had served, fought, sacrificed, but their war had become a symbol of controversy, and the nation that had sent them now seemed reluctant to embrace them. For years the wounds of Vietnam festered quietly. Post-traumatic stress, then called shell shock, or combat fatigue, went unrecognized. Families fractured. Communities carried invisible scars. In Vietnam itself, reunification under the communist government brought hardship, re-education camps, refugee flows, economic struggles, but also the end of decades of war. In Washington, lawmakers sought to make sure such a war could not be waged again without proper oversight. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, over Nixon's veto, requiring the president to consult and report to Congress before introducing U.S. forces into hostilities. Though its constitutionality was debated, it symbolized the new skepticism toward executive war-making power. The military, embarrassed by the loss, undertook a period of soul-searching. Generals and strategists examined how a force so technologically superior could be stymied by a smaller, poorer opponent. They concluded that metrics like body counts were poor indicators of success, that clear objectives, unity of command, and public support were essential, and that counterinsurgency required far more than firepower. During the late 1970s and 1980s, American culture processed the Vietnam experience through books, movies, and music. Films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket depicted the war's chaos, moral ambiguity, and psychological toll. Authors wrote memoirs, histories, novels that tried to capture the war's complexity. Musicians sang of protest and of loss. This cultural reckoning helped reshape public understanding of the war from a distant Cold War battle into a human tragedy and a lesson about power, hubris, and limits. In Vietnam, the government rebuilt slowly. The war's devastation left infrastructure shattered, farmland poisoned by chemicals, families torn apart. Yet the country moved on, trading with former enemies decades later, opening its economy, eventually normalizing relations with the United States in the 1990s. Former foes shook hands. American veterans returned to visit battlefields where they had once fought, some seeking closure, others offering aid. The war's bitterness began to soften, though not vanish. Looking back from today, historians see the Vietnam War during the Johnson and Nixon years as a turning point in U.S. foreign policy. Johnson's escalation reflected the belief that American power could shape distant conflicts, that credibility required action, that containment was worth any cost. Nixon's withdrawal reflected the recognition of limits, the search for new strategies, the effort to balance Cold War imperatives with domestic turmoil. Together their presidencies marked the arc from overconfidence to disillusionment, from escalation to exit. Each believed he was acting in America's best interest, but each faced the same dilemma: how to fight a war when the objective was unclear, the ally unreliable, the enemy relentless, and the public skeptical. The question of winning or losing remains. Militarily, the U.S. inflicted enormous losses on North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, destroyed infrastructure, demonstrated tactical superiority. Politically, it failed to secure its ally. Strategically, it did not prevent Vietnam's unification under communism. Diplomatically, it eventually restored relations with Vietnam and maintained its alliances elsewhere. Psychologically, it lost the aura of invincibility. In the ledger of history, these entries defy a simple sum. The war also changed how presidents approached subsequent conflicts. No longer would large-scale ground interventions be launched without intense debate, at least for a time. When the U.S. intervened later in places like Grenada, Panama, or the Persian Gulf, it did so with clearer objectives, overwhelming force and shorter timelines. Yet the Vietnam Syndrome, as some called it, the reluctance to get bogged down, haunted policymakers. Debates over interventions in the Balkans, in Iraq, in Afghanistan all invoked Vietnam as a warning. Some lessons were heeded, others forgotten. For the American people, Vietnam created a new relationship with government and media. They learned to question official statements, to demand accountability, to see war not as distant but as something that touches every home. The anti-war movement left a legacy of civic activism. Veterans groups fought for recognition of Agent Orange exposure, for mental health services, for memorials. The black granite wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, inscribed with names of the dead, became a place of pilgrimage, healing, and reflection. As the narrator of this long and winding story, I return one last time to the image of presidents. Lyndon Johnson, sitting in the Oval Office, head in his hands, tormented by casualty lists. Richard Nixon, poring over maps with Henry Kissinger, balancing withdrawal and bombing, diplomacy and politics. Gerald Ford, watching helplessly as Saigon falls, asking Congress for aid that will not come. Each man caught in forces larger than himself, each shaping and shaped by the war. Their decisions intertwined with the fate of millions. And I return also to the image of the ordinary soldier, the ordinary Vietnamese villager, the student protester, the refugee on a boat. Because the war was not just about presidents and policies. It was about human beings, their hopes and fears, their endurance and suffering. To tell the story of Vietnam from Johnson to Nixon is to tell a story of a nation's power tested, of a people's resilience, of the costs of decisions made far from the battlefield. In the end, perhaps the question, did America win or lose, is too simple. Perhaps the real question is, what did America learn? Did it learn the limits of force, the importance of legitimacy, the need for honesty with the public? Did it learn how to care for those it sends to fight? Did it learn to weigh the human cost before committing? Some say yes, others say no. The answer may lie not in speeches or histories but in the lives changed by the war. Yet for many Americans the feeling remains that Vietnam was a loss. It was a loss of life, of purpose, of faith in leaders. It was a loss of the illusion that the United States could shape any outcome anywhere with enough money and might. It was a loss that cast a shadow over decades of policy. And for the Vietnamese, it was victory and loss combined. Victory in reunification, loss in destruction and hardship. And so my narrative draws to a close, not with a neat conclusion but with a reflection. The Vietnam War from Johnson to Nixon stands as one of the defining episodes of the 20th century, a mirror in which America saw both its power and its vulnerability, its ideals and its contradictions. Whether it was won or lost may be debated forever. But its lessons endure for any nation that contemplates war, for any leader who believes they can bend history to their will, for any people who must decide what they are willing to sacrifice. I leave you with the sound of helicopter blades fading into distance, of waves lapping against refugee boats, of footsteps at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial where fingers trace engraved names. In those sounds you may hear both victory and defeat, both pride and regret, both the past and a warning for the future. That is the story of Vietnam, of America, of the presidents who led and the people who bore the cost, and of a question that still echoes: win or loss?